digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we are joined once again by the lovely Cathy Haxall, who returns to us, of HTC Vive, whilst also being the author of Marketing Realities book, which is now available. We'll share the links with you later on. We also have with us the lovely Oscar Clark of Unity, and also Rocket Lolly. Have I said that right, Oscar? Rocket Lolly?
Yeah, Rocket Lolly Games.
Rocket Lolly Games, who also has a lovely game out all about the Rocky Horror Show, I believe.
It's not out yet. It's still in development, but yeah.
It's going to be there soon. And we have the lovely Katie Goody from Triangular Pixels with us. And we have with us the legend that is Shafi, who is the co-founder of Medical Realities. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Now, Thanks for having me.
I'm going to ask you to briefly explain a little bit more about what you're up to. And I'm going to start with you, Shafi, because I feel like there's a lot of context here that needs to be explained about this rock star status of yours. I say this on the basis of I've seen some of your stage entrances and you truly are a rock star. Please do explain to our lovely listeners more about what you do.
Okay, that's really kind. Sadly, I can't make a rockstar entrance on Skype. I'd love to one day. My day job, I'm Professor Chevy Ahmed. I'm a consultant surgeon. I specialise in dealing with patients who have a unfortunate diagnosis of colorectal cancer, and I'm a keyhole surgeon working in London at the Royal London Hospital. And in my kind of other capacity that I have, I'm an associate dean of the medical school. Been involved in teaching education for a long time, over 20 years. And I've also developed a couple of tech companies, one based around virtual reality, augmented reality called Medical Realities, and also more latterly developed a company in blockchain in health, and also dealing with a communications company, which is similar to kind of WhatsApp for healthcare professionals. So I tend to keep myself fairly broad. I do a lot of work internationally in terms of teaching and training. And I guess I have a global kind of presence in what I do, the work that I do.
Wonderful, thank you. And Katie, why don't you tell us all about the wonderful things that you and the lovely people over at Triangular Pixels are up to?
Well, we go to the beach quite a bit because we're down in Cornwall. It's quite nice down here still no snow though. But so we've been busy making a game called Smash It Plunder, better known for another game that we made a couple of years ago now for launch of HTC Vive, which was Unseen Diplomacy. And yeah, we just generally do games and a little bit of freelance work for occasional other people. So yeah, but otherwise we're just littered all around the country. So we've got people in Nottingham, Scotland, Plymouth, and over down in Bude in Cornwall.
A true independent game studio.
Pretty much.
And Oscar, why don't you tell us all about the work that you're doing at Unity, but also a little bit about your Rocky Horror Show game?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about something I think is a bit more relevant to what Shafi was talking about. So I'm an evangelist at Unity. I talk about a whole bunch of stuff, mostly about the sort of the business of making games and the kind of processes of getting discovered, design, and all this other stuff. So I'm a bit different to the other evangelists out there. The reason I thought I picked up on one of Shafi's comments earlier was this whole blockchain thing. So I'm working as a consultant on a title called Reality Clash, which is an AR game that recently raised quite a lot of money on an initial coin offering with blockchain, Ethereum backed. So we're in interesting times. We're looking at the way that how you create ideas, share ideas, and raise money for ideas. So, cool stuff.
Awesome, thank you. And Cathy, why don't you tell us all about your exciting role with HTC Vive, but also tell us about your wonderful new book with Samantha Wolf, is your co-author.
Yeah, so I work as a VR evangelist for HTC Vive. We basically representing the premium hardware that's available out there that has room scale. And, I'm recently minted, so I just got hired to do this job. I'm very excited to kind of get out there and spread the word. And I'm also a marketing futurist. Above everything, I'm a marketing futurist. And I was lucky enough to partner with Samantha, and we wrote a book specifically about virtual reality and augmented reality marketing called Marketing New Realities. And I'm also an advisor to several augmented reality blockchain companies.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. And as I kind of discussed previously with Shafi, and I'm just going to kind of reiterate here, I wanted to try and dig in today into this kind of evolution, if you like, in the way that we communicate with people who are essentially part of this next digital generation, if that's what we want to call it. Everybody's got a different name for this, whether it's Generation Z, Y, X, whatever we want to call them, whatever fancy term it is. But this generation of digital natives is probably the most relevant statement. And the reason that I wanted to discuss this was because of something that Shafi posted a little while ago, ironically enough, on social media, discussing the fact that as a surgeon and as an educator, that he had been sharing a lot of what he does on social media channels and platforms, and that he felt that he was getting a lot more engagement, a lot more traction with this younger generation of new surgeons and aspiring medical students who were engaging with him on these platforms. And Shafi, I don't know if you want to give some context to that information.
Sure, I'd be delighted to. Yeah, so look, I guess my remit is really around global health and how do we sort of improve the equity of healthcare around the globe. And, about 2 years ago, if we go back to kind of the story that I've been trying to share with others, a report came out from the Lancet Commission. And in my own specialty of surgery, it was the first paper that quantified a global problem, that we have essentially 2/3 of the population, that's 5 billion people, can't access surgery that's required for emergency, that we're going to save lives, etc. That to me sounded like an terrible inequity. But that also meant that we have to train more people, perhaps shorten their training. We need to train 2 million more surgeons fairly quickly to somehow overcome the deficits that we see. So that's the kind of background. Then my kind of learning and teaching over many years has shown me that in medicine, for example, we've been stuck with what I call dogma and tradition, which sort of holds back technology and its interface. And we've been teaching the same way for surgery for a long time. And that means in the operating theatre, we have maybe 4, 5, 6 medical students who are usually in the back of the room, usually not being engaged as much because the operation's carrying on, they're not really part of it. And actually usually on their smartphones in the back, texting their friends, messaging their friends on Facebook, on Instagram, that kind of thing. I thought, hold a second, that's interesting. They're not engaging, but yet they are engaging with the smartphone. So how do we use smartphones to connect people? I remember smartphones fairly ubiquitous. And social media, for me, is a really powerful agent. I've experimented with live 360 video transmission a year ago, and I transmitted a live operation to 55,000 people. I used Google Glass 2 or 3 years ago to 14,000 people around the globe. But these are new platforms. Why not use platforms like social media, which are free, readily available, and have important access? So, for example, Facebook has 2 billion people on a daily basis. Instagram has 300 million people. Twitter has also about 300 million. And Snapchat has 175 million. So I pushed out real life training on social media. I experimented with Facebook, first of all, and I actually did a live operation on Facebook Live, one click, about 18 months ago, to the trainings in Bangladesh, where I was at the time doing some operations philanthropically. Immediately, 10,000 surgeons joined in the conversation. Huge impact in terms of that network. I thought, well, what about Snapchat? Now, Snapchat was interesting because although I'm a bit old for Snapchat, I'm not young anymore, because 75% of the 175 million users are between the ages of 17 and 25. That's way younger than me. But however, it's relevant because those are the ages of my medical students and my surgical trainees. They understand that they're loyal to the brand. They love what they do. They're constantly on it. People spend 4 hours a day on social media, which is the current kind of statistic. So I pushed out an operation on Snapchat. I was really not sure this was the right thing to do. It's social media, it's free access, anyone can watch the operation, for example. So I experimented a year ago using spectacles when they first arrived. Literally, I was the first one to get in the country. I thought, can I train people using 10-second clip bites, which is what Snapchat does, onto my story, which will then disappear, add annotation. And I thought, let's experiment. I really was unsure. I sent it to 200 or 300 students initially, but then it went really viral. Every magazine picked up the story, including Time magazine. And within about a month, it has been watched by 2 million people, with 100,000 downloads on YouTube alone, and about 56 million people on Twitter were discussing the impact of my operation, which was a simple operation, they're pushing out to the globe. So that had immediate impact. And further that, earlier this year, I used Twitter. I was given the Twitter account for NHS. I managed the whole account for a week, and I did a whole live operation using tweets for a whole day, seeing whether I could educate the public and students alike. And that got great traction, about 1 million people following the operation just on tweets alone. So it just showed you the impact that you have immediately of sharing knowledge on a global scale. Tanya.
One Wonderful. I'm sorry, I can't get the image out of my head of you in the operating theatre with your Snapchat glasses on, because that's been burned into my brain now. So
I'm sorry, Tanya.
It's just so unusual to see. But I'm kind of curious to explore some of the facets of this in a little bit more depth. And I'm going to throw this one out to you, Kathy, because I find some of what Shafi is talking about to be incredibly interesting, in as much as, yes, there is a relevancy of young people who are on these platforms. But what's more interesting is the content that Shafi is sharing that one would not traditionally think that young people may necessarily have an interest in, such as, literally watching an operation happen. I suppose the perception, especially by a lot of marketers, let's be honest, is that most of these young people would much rather be, looking at TMZ or the Kardashians or, something equally as frivolous. And whether or not there is perhaps more to it than necessarily just the superfluous and very superficial level things that people assume young people want to consume on these networks and these platforms. So from your perspective as a marketeer, I'm curious what your perception is of the type of content that Shafi has been sharing and the reasons for why there has been that deep traction with it.
It's a great question. So it's interesting to hear Shafi talk about how he used live video and obviously Snapchat through the Snapchat spectacles, and then now VR. I come from that line. So I went from social media, so PR and social media. I was very, very kind of dedicated to live video. Periscope, I was one of the first people on Periscope. I was very active in Facebook Live. And then from there transitioned into VR. So I kind of see this continuum. And Mark Zuckerberg actually alluded to this continuum when he spoke at F8 this year. From a generational perspective, this is what I found. And I wrote this article September of last year, was it? Or August last year, when I talked about how we talk about digital natives, but I see this changing and shifting from not just being digital natives, let's say the younger generations being called digital natives. Some of us are digital natives, but transitioning from calling them digital natives to the younger generations, like my children, who I consider to be virtual or augmented natives. Where it's transitioning, you're going to go from that part of just social media and being digital, let's say, to being living more in a virtual augmented space. So I see this kind of transition, and I think that interest is it's part because we're taking people either through live video or through virtual reality and augmented reality to places that they cannot go otherwise. So I do love how live video and now VR and AR are going to democratize access to a lot of this content. So from an education standpoint and a training standpoint, the impact that these new technologies are going to have on education and on training are incredibly important. Even if we get away from, let's say, the younger generations or even the people that are coming into the workforce. I worked with UPS as their virtual reality expert when they were rolling out their virtual training for their drivers. And I just see that virtual training, augmented reality training too, these are going to be aspects that are going to be even more important. And that is going to bleed into training of many different kinds, including education. So I'm already seeing it in schools. For example, my children's school uses these augmented reality workbooks. They use Aurasma as kind of the app that they use to augment the books. And I'm starting to see this kind of continuum of pushing, education and training forward. So I think that's kind of a long, wide answer to what you're asking me, Tanya, but I just kind of wanted to bring that out. You know how I am when I get on your podcast. I kind of go there. So yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation of meeting people where they are, especially younger people where they live, where's their ecosystem, and where is that ecosystem going?
Okay, so
Can I just chuck something in at that?
Well, I was about to come to you anyway, but Oscar, go for it.
I have this terrible tendency of butting in. I kind of, having been on that bleeding edge for the last 20 years, I always feel that we are, you've got, I think what Kay's saying is right, it's a spectrum. But I always worry that we get ahead of ourselves. And where we think people are isn't where the critical mass is. So I totally agree with this idea of living in an augmented space in the long term. But I think people generally are still coming to terms with what social media means, let alone understanding what virtual reality or AR might mean. I think people are still thinking Ready Player One rather than kind of a living heads-up display kind of universe, if that makes sense. So I don't think people really, understand beyond the narrative fictions that we're presented of what the future looks like. I think people don't really understand what it really looks like yet.
It's interesting that you say this though, because and here's what I just want to kind of narrow this down a little bit in terms of what you're talking about, which is I think that there is a certain degree of acceleration in the last couple of decades when it comes to the mainstream consumer understanding of technology and trends as they emerge. And I think there are different types of these audiences where you have the kind of mainstream where it does take a little while for these things to trickle down to these people, but actually there's this growing audience of people who are a little bit more on that cutting edge, the gamers of this world and the tech, enthusiasts of this world, those people who are like, the entire audience of Oculus Rift, you know what I mean? These people who want to be ahead of the curve.
This is new. This is the whole kind of the Gartner hype curve principle, and it's still applying. But when we have so many false storms, when we see technologies, promise, and I'm a massive believer in VR and AR, as you know. But there are a lot of people who will look at where we are with VR, and despite the amazing success that it represents compared to what you could have possibly predicted, there are other people who look at it and say, well, it's not there yet, because they're looking for ubiquity now. And I think that there's a tension, something which we as professionals need to be aware of, which is that, yes, we should be using the technology to its fullest extent, but we should also work out where the critical mass of audience currently are too, and make sure that our messages go to where the audience is, not just where we think they should be.
Okay, so I'm gonna go on this mini rant just because I feel that it needs to be said, just for context. and I know that you've heard me say this many times, so I'm going to do it again, which is to kind of point out that when it comes to VR and AR as well, to a certain extent, it's not new. It's been around way longer than 5 years. It's one of those things that a lot of people forget, that it's been around for, a good 30 years or so. And that actually certain industries that are not public facing, they're not consumer facing in any way, shape or form, have been using this technology for quite some time. And, as you and I know, Oscar, the defense industry have been using, VR and immersive technologies long enough that they have their own terminology for it. They call it synthetic wrap, synthetic training, synthetic, whatever the thing is, they refer to it as synthetic because that's their terminology for immersive technologies. And there's plenty of suppliers and what they would call a prime in the defense industries who've been supplying this kind of hardware and this kind of software for decades at this stage. So I do think it's one of those things a lot of people forget, that it isn't something that's new and shiny, and that every home has to have one in their physical living room, or that it has to be consumer led. I think many people forget that actually the business to business market for VR is way stronger and much more profitable and actually much more mature than people would give it credit for.
The people who are communicating to sort of the general audiences need things like what Sheffy's done to sort of remind them that actually a lot of this technology is in their hands already.
Yeah.
Classic example is, the sort of AR or the VR stuff is that being able to get hold of a Daydream or a Gear VR and be able to see panoramic photos you took 2 or 3 years ago and feel like you were there. That's a magical feeling, and it's the least of what we can offer in terms of the communication opportunity. So I think this idea of being able to sort of remember where people are, but also remember where, it's part of our job as communicators to help them understand where we're going to and why it's important to them emotionally. I still remember to this day when we had the first camera phones. I was at 3 in the operator before we'd launched, and people were saying to us, no one's going to want a camera phone. Why would anyone want a camera on a phone? It's ridiculous. Can you imagine not having a camera on a phone? Can you imagine Apple launching without any manufacturer launching without telling you how amazing their depth of field, their focus, their quality of picture taking could possibly be on the phone? You just can't imagine it, can you?
It's an interesting kind of conundrum that we've got ourselves into in terms of the expectation of technology. But Katie, I'm going to throw this one at you just because Oscar's opened the can of worms now and he's mentioned Ready Player One, and so now I have to follow him down the rabbit hole. But I'm just really aware, bearing in mind that we have Kathy with us, who is a futurist, and you know you're deeply embedded in the games industry. I'm going to kind of put this one to you, which is this idea that within Ready Player One, and I'm assuming, by the way, you've read Ready Player One.
Nope. No. I find it difficult to read books, so
Oh, okay. The movie's coming out in March 2018.
The audiobook is really good as well.
Yes. But the lovely folk at Warner Brothers have been making that movie, and that's due to come out in March 2018.
I know they filmed half it in Birmingham.
They did film some of it in Birmingham. It was directed by the lovely Steven Spielberg. But
and HTC Vive has the rights to that for the VR part. So I just wanted to add that there.
Watch this space for the interesting things that will be coming for the Ready Player One movie, and also the I'm not going to say anything else. The Oasis is all I'm going to say. But what I will say is this, Katie. In the context of Ready Player one of the most interesting parts of this is the fact that in this futuristic dystopian future where there's not enough food and there's not enough resources and everybody's living in poverty and it's a pretty depressing future, as with most sci-fi futures, the one thing that they all have is this escape into a virtual environment, the Oasis, which is essentially a massive MMORPG type environment within VR. And in that context, one of the things that's quite interesting is that in the general world, in the big bad world of Oasis, you can be anything you want to be and you can go anywhere you want to go as long as you've got the credits to do it. And, you know, you gain experience points for, you know, killing various little monsters and beasties and exploring and all the things that you would in a normal game context. The one thing that is interesting, though, is that education has been shifted into the Oasis and that you can go to a whole planet worth of different schools. They all exist on the surface of the planet, and you go and you go to school. But in the school environment, you have to have an avatar name and identity that is associated to your actual identity. So it's connected to your birth records. But then once you step out of the boundaries of the school, you then ping over into whatever your fictional fantasy avatar in the kind of game world is. And I find this quite interesting because it plays on a lot of the behaviours of gamers. That's one of the reasons why I think Ready Player One is such a seminal book for a lot of people who are gamers or within the games industry, is because it does reflect so much on you know, a lot of these kind of MMO and MMORPG behaviours. And so I am curious from a future gazing perspective and this idea of education within the virtual environment, whether or not we think that there is some dangers inherent in taking these gaming behaviours, if you like, and applying them into these educational virtual environments.
I've got a wonderful tale about this already.
Ooh,
because it's already happening.
Ooh.
So just literally yesterday, we were out with a couple of friends here in Cornwall, and their daughters one of the daughters goes to the local secondary school, which is just around the corner. And this isn't exactly a high-tech secondary school, you know, we're out in the countryside here. I was so surprised to hear about the fact that they have achievement points. They call them achievement points, and they have an app on their mobile to keep track of these achievement points. And like their whole school career now is basically earning these achievement points. And this is great for them because it's like, you know, like they get actual prizes. They get iPads at the end of the year and things and all sorts. And
gamified learning. I love it.
Yeah. Like we used to call them house points, you know, very Harry Potter-esque at my secondary school. However, they've also got what they called like bad points or something. So every time you were naughty, you would get like not negative achievement points, you would get like these bad points. And because they gamified that as well, there's some kids that are determined to get the most bad points.
There's always one.
So it's I guess that shows the sort of dangers of just introducing general gamification without actually necessarily getting people that understand games and, like, I guess encouraging players to do things. Because I would have told them straight away, going, no, obviously that means that kids are going to keep gaming that and wanted to get the most bad points. Like, they're deviant, they're deviant gamers. And I'm one of those deviant gamers that would try and get around or do something really weird with...
Contrary to whatever the system intended.
Yeah, I'm terrible with paper RPGs. I am horrible to whoever's my game master. So I guess if we blatantly just tell people to go, yeah, just gamify everything and like get everyone inside VR and like without actually necessarily educating the teachers and educating the parents as well, then unexpected behaviors will occur because humans are very good at doing deviant things like that.
It's interesting that you say this because I know that there's been a lot of chatter lately about this new system that they're introducing in China. And I don't know if you're terribly aware of this or not, but in China, they have this test that they're running where they are giving citizenship points. And everything you do is going to reflect on how many citizen points you have. And only people with, a good amount of points will be able to interact and do certain things within society. And if you don't have good citizenship point levels, then you won't be able to do certain things. And I don't know if anybody saw the Black Mirror episode with Bryce Dallas Howard.
I didn't see the Black Mirror episode. I saw that Chinese episode, and there was also an episode of the Orville that did something recently as well, which is basically upvoting and downvoting each other on everything. So much so that everything had been like a democracy, and so even the laws, like someone like they just decide to basically like erase your brain if everyone's voted that you are not a nice person because you've done something silly. Like it's not so broken the law. It's just everyone's agreed, no, that's not nice. We're going to erase your brain now. So I
feels a little bit harsh.
Yeah, it's a little bit harsh. I should imagine it won't go quite down that route, but you can already see it. I mean, I guess I'm just a little bit aware of the whole. I mean, bring it back to the Bitcoin thing. I can see this a bit of a future where everyone's got their own version of Bitcoin, like Amazon got their own version of Bitcoin, Google got their own version of Bitcoin. You get paid in your company's employer's version, and somehow you have to convert between all these different versions. But then you start sort of breaking out the chains of what's sort of what you can get points for. Like you can get paid and negative pay for things because it's like it's outside the realms of normal like legalized pay system. What can we say about employers getting paid in?
It's interesting though, because one of the things, again, from a games industry perspective, and Oscar, I know that you and Katie will have the most to say about this, but I'm kind of curious to hear Shafi and Kathy's view on this as well, which is that invariably in gaming, one of the single biggest issues with any game that you make, where it's a community-led kind of environment, MMO type of environment, is ultimately you will have people who farm. And by farming, we mean people who basically spend all of their time trying to cheat the system to be able to get more currency, whatever the currency is, normally gold of some sort. So you'd be a gold farmer, for example, trying to gain as much of that currency as possible to then sell it in a sub-economy in real world currency to other people who want that thing. And so every major game that's ever existed has always had a farming problem of some sort. If there is any inherent value to the digital content of what is within that game environment, somebody in the world will pay real world money to actually obtain those items. And some really good examples in terms of just kind of getting a sense of how much money we're talking about here would be the EVE Online incident, where there was a massive battle in EVE Online, which is a big MMO game, and they tallied up the damage afterwards and equated it to real life monetary value, because a lot of these people had paid for elements of the things that there had been lost. They'd actually paid real life cash for them, so they're able to get a really good sense of how much money it was. And it was something like $40,000 worth of damage done in one battle.
It was enormous. I've forgotten how much it was exactly.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So it's a couple of nuances on this. So obviously I worked on PlayStation Home, so it was a slightly different case. But we did still have a lot of these conversations, and we had a lot of conversations with the guys at Sony Online Entertainment, John Smedley and co, about the way things work with EverQuest and various sort of things like that. So one of the reasons why we didn't allow you to sort of pay out, cash out in PlayStation Home and games like that is because if you have this cash out mechanism, then this farming problem becomes really difficult to manage, particularly because whilst it's incredibly useful and valuable for the economy of the game, surprisingly, because it's a bit like selling
black market
games.
basically.
But there's a variety of ways of looking at it. Look at it in the same way as reselling a pre-owned game. And you can see how that's the same principle.
Yeah.
However, what it does, it means there's more money in the system. It means that people aren't buying directly from the publisher. So that kind of works, though, because you're charging high prices for a brand new game and cheaper prices for the refresh game. But would people have bought the high-priced game at the same volumes had there not been a secondary market? And a similar principle applies for whether you're talking about in-game weapons or hats or costumes or whatever else, or gold. But then you get to the shadier, the darker side of that shade. And that's when we're talking about farms that have been set up by criminal organizations working out of countries with lax employment histories. So if you think about the amount of price inequality there is in terms of hiring people, you can imagine how you could pay somebody with dirty money. They could spend all their time making gold, doing gold farming, and then essentially you get the cash back that's clean via the secondary markets, and it's all being paid for by the dirty money. That's where the real problems lie.
Yeah, essentially we're talking about money laundering in many aspects, and and that's where I was kind of going with this. In as much as I find it quite interesting that, as Katie kind of points out in the context of real life examples where people are gamifying communities or gamifying certain kind of things, whether it's school education or whether it's like this thing in China, the one thing that seems to be lacking is any direct knowledge of the game design infrastructure and how things like farming and how things like, essentially people trying to cheat the system or certain types of gamer behaviors will naturally come to the fore when somebody tries to gamify behaviors or tries to manipulate behaviors.
My point is that, there are some risks, absolutely, but it's not just a black and white situation is the point I was trying to make.
It's absolutely not black and white.
It's about understanding the audience and understanding what is an appropriate and useful measure that people can gamify. And in fact, it's actually about understanding what gamification is about, because gamification is simply about using the knowledge that we have about user and player experience and applying that to other stuff.
I guess you're having to educate the educators and educate, like I said, the parents as well. I guess bringing it back to hardware, even we say about having to introduce like VR into schools and AR into schools and like touch devices into schools. I just remember getting not a smartphone, it was smarter in the sense it had the internet, the panic in the school when they went, suddenly these kids, they seem to be able to connect to the internet and they could research all the questions. They don't have to read the book, they could just research the questions underneath the table. And the whole calculator versus non-calculator, smart watches and having to ban people holding their smartphones. Because, when I very first started school, phones weren't even a thing. So,
but then,
people...
again, you say this, sorry, Katie, I'm just kind of, this is a debate that's been had before, and I just want to kind of bring this up, which is it necessarily a bad thing that kids are learning to be able to look things up and be able to utilize the technology around them to look things up? Because if anything, what that's doing is shifting the mindset, is shifting the frame within which they learn, within which they acquire information and how they understand how to get to the information that they need. And so rather than this kind of old mentality or traditionalist mentality of you need to learn something verbatim and to be able to reiterate it back, and then when you have an exam paper be able to regurgitate whatever it is that was kind of stuffed into your brain over the last 6 years or whatever, and be able to literally just churn it out onto an exam paper at the right point and at the right time, versus understanding and having an understanding of how to get to the answer. And
I totally believe in that secondary one. It's the way that I've learned, I feel, rather than actually, I can't keep facts and figures in my head. I'm terrible for it. But with coursework, I was able to really shine. And if you ask most programmers to do a programming test without actually having access to the internet, they will hate your guts. Yes. You get it.
Tanya, can I go ahead and add something? Would
yes, absolutely.
So it's really interesting because I have little children and I kind of see how they're being taught. And in their schools, the schools that I've chosen for them, it is, obviously they're very STEM focused, but at the same time, I've made sure that the schools that they go to also have a huge component of arts and creativity, because I think that that's where that part comes in, with that creativity, that arts, that A in STEAM, not STEM, science, technology, engineering, arts, mathematics, etc. I think that is incredibly important. And I see a lot of, let's say, schools solely focusing on the STEM part and thinking that they don't need the A in STEAM. And I see it from my kids' perspective. It helps them become better, because they're little, they're learning to code nowadays. Like, that's just what they do. But it helps them become better at that, at being more creative, of figuring out solutions, of figuring out how to do all these things. So definitely, and I think that's part of, it helps them gamify things as well, and have a better understanding. And I see it when I see them trying to solve a problem. Yes, they can regurgitate content, etc. But I see them being more creative and asking themselves questions, or asking me a question. And I see that kind of that spark that I think is missing in a lot of schools.
I fully agree, in as much as it's one of those things that a lot of people think is somehow bad to facilitate and encourage that kind of independent thinking and creativity. But I am curious, Shafi.
Isn't that what's great about the fact that we've got this ability as games to inspire and attract people to all of those aspects? And, again, to Shafi's point earlier, what he's doing there is bringing that into a much more realistic world. It's not just about, these virtual things. He's a real person undergoing a real, experience and being, hopefully saved through that process.
Absolutely. But what I was going to ask you, Shafi, is just because you're probably the least gamer person on this conversation right now. I am kind of curious from your perspective, though, when it comes to your students and the approach of this kind of next generation of learning, if that's the way you want to put it, and this idea of gamified learning, which I think is actually in some ways quite dangerous, because a lot of people apply this term gamification and they really don't understand what it actually means, and they don't understand the concepts and the precepts behind game design and game behaviours. I'm kind of curious from your perspective whether or not you think there are inherent negative dangers lurking in the back of that when somebody says, oh yeah, let's gamify the way that we teach medical students, and whether or not there is that inherent risk, as kind of Katie was alluding to, of people wanting to be what we would call deviant gamers, who are looking to accrue the negative points or the negative experiences. Whether or not we might find that there are some risks, especially with things like medical students, for example, where if we are gamifying and we're rewarding based on kind of gamification style learning, that there is perhaps danger of people cutting corners or skipping, crucial pieces of knowledge and information that actually they really do need to know this stuff.
Hey, interesting question. I'd say after 20 years of teaching medical students, they're always going to cut corners. They always do cut corners, right? Yeah. So that's nothing new, right? Basically, where education is driven, it's driven by exams. Whatever question you set at the exam is what they'll learn, nothing else. In and around that, knowledge is going to be very much directed. How do you maximize the opportunity to pass the exam at the end? It's always been the way. The question is, how do you broaden the horizon? How do you broaden a student's perspective and a kind of knowledge base? So one of the things that actually is quite relevant to this conversation, actually. So I've been struggling with the medical curriculum for a long time. So, for example, we've taken this medical school curriculum as to be for 5 years, okay? Now, I'm not sure who designed a 5-year curriculum many years ago. It hasn't changed. It's still 5 years, right? Over hundreds of years. And my question, first of all, should it be 5 years? Should it be 4 years? How does it take to make a doctor or train doctor, etc.? And the content itself is much the same. We take things I've been worried about. We take students at the age of 18, in the case of people who do A-levels straight to medical school, or those that do graduate entry program, which is becoming more common at the age of 21 plus, for example. They could be 25, 28, 30 plus. So we bring them into the medical school curriculum. And what we're doing, we're saying, right, here is the curriculum, and it's the same. It's the anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, the basic sciences, and then clinical sciences in the hospital. And it's very one-dimensional. So I ran an experiment last year. I thought, you know what? A lot of my students have other skill sets. They're artists. They're app designers, they're developers, they're coders. They run businesses in their spare time. They work for a living. but we don't ever see the other side of that equation. And I think that's the reason why we have such a degree of unhappiness and discontent in the medical schools and also amongst doctors around the world, because we're making them into one-dimensional human beings. What I did last year, I said, okay, look, let's forget that. I said to a cohort of students, what are your skill sets? What else do you do in your spare time? Do you do art? Are you entrepreneurs? Do you do things? So I got a lot of good feedback from that. And I ran a pilot for the first time last year at our medical school. Now, our medical school, you'll put it in context, Bart's Medical School is 1,000 years old, right? The oldest medical school, one of the oldest in the world, actually. Really ancient, really steeped in dogma tradition, but modernizing itself. So I took a cohort of 120 students, a third of the year, and we taught them differently. We had creative thinkers in. We had app designers, coders, developers. You love this, Tanya, right up your street. We had tech people talk about the future of technology. We talked about my colleagues at Singularity University beamed in live, talked about the future of medicine and healthcare. Guys from Harvard beamed in. They went away for about 4 or 5 weeks with a business development idea to develop something that would translate to healthcare, make it better, and improve outcomes. They would give mentorship by tech kind of companies and mentorship through people that are used to creating something unique and ideas that go straight to market. They then had a hackathon, and in the end, they had a pitch in front of Dragon's Den with venture capitalists and healthcare professionals to see if their idea could go and make improvements. The winners were given a 3-month place for a tech company. Now, that was the first time in the UK, if not the world, where we're integrating a different way of thinking. Because I think the healthcare in the future requires people that are flexible, different mindsets that can use technology at the moment and have ideas how to improve efficiencies of healthcare in the future. Because at the moment, there's no more new money coming into healthcare. That's it. We're bankrupt. The whole world is bankrupt unless Bitcoin becomes more common for all of us. So actually, we need to be much more responsive, more flexible, and improve the efficiency of healthcare using tech. So we need to create the kind of doctors that are going to understand that and to be able to be not scared of challenging tradition and say, look, how do we make this better? How do I go to market? And this year, I'm pleased to say that the Bart's X Medicine Program, that's what I've called it, is now going to be embedded into the curriculum for all 350 students in our medical school. It's the first medical school in the world to embed it into a curriculum. I'm not worried about self-selecting a few people who might be interested. They're always self-selecting. It's to the lowest common denominator. Can you get the lowest person in our medical school who doesn't understand tech to engage into innovation, technology, and healthcare? Because then I think you're going to make the healthcare better in the future. So that kind of, I think, education thing that I think we talked about earlier is put into context about the broad spectrum of human behavior. And can we bring out all those facets to create the better doctors of tomorrow?
Well, I think you have just preempted my next question. Which was to ask what you guys think is the next kind of step that needs to happen, whether that's a cultural shift or a technological shift that will kind of change the way that we're operating and doing business and communicating and teaching. And what you're doing, Shafi, at Bart's is literally that. I think you've kind of covered it already. But Kathy, from your perspective as a futurist, what do you think is the thing that could really help to shift things and move things forward?
I don't know. It's a really interesting discussion because there's so many things kind of coming together. And it's interesting. When I do a keynote on virtual reality and augmented reality, I always frame it from the perspective that it's not just that technology. It's all this emerging tech. We're having, everyone's bringing up blockchain, for example, during this podcast. It's a huge combination of all this emerging tech coming together to push us forward to what some people call the fourth industrial, revolution or the fourth transformation, whatever we want to call it. So, it's a conversation. It's a very broad conversation, I think. It includes artificial intelligence, machine learning, includes 5G and 6G speeds, it includes blockchain, VR and AR. And even if you just look at augmented reality from the perspective of it being the next computing platform, that is a huge conversation in itself. I think if people would have been told many years back, how the personal computer and the iPhone were going to, the mobile phone were going to change our lives, I think people would have paid, if they knew what they know now, they would have paid attention. So for me, it's a lot of education, a lot of shift in the mindset. From a marketing perspective, I can tell you that it's a shift in the mindset of understanding content. Content is a very big word for us in marketing, obviously. From a social media marketing perspective, from a content and marketing perspective, for people to understand that, especially with the younger generations, we're going to move away from content that is flat. The 2D content that we're used to looking at on YouTube or on our screens. We're moving away from that. And one of my clearest examples that I use when I try to explain how this is shifting, because we're all so used to thinking in flat, obviously, is when I do, for example, demo with Google Tilt Brush. So the people that don't know what Google Tilt Brush is, it's a program where you put on a virtual reality headset and you are basically painting inside virtual reality. So when you're painting in this virtual reality, your art can be art that is 3D and 360. It's all encompassing. It's not flat. And when I have, for example, people of my age or older doing tilt brush, they tend to draw like a flat house or draw things that they're used to drawing on paper. But when I bring in, let's say, my children or bring young, children into VR, many of them draw things around them. For example, one of the kids drew an igloo around them. They were inside an igloo. And that change and that shift in how they see the world is very pivotal in how this is going to change. And I think that for those of us, for the older generations that don't necessarily understand this pivot, this change, that is one of the things I think needs to change. It's education. It's a shift in the mindset of how we perceive content, especially from a marketing perspective. So I hope that helps to kind of answer part of your question. I mean, it's a very big question because it's so many things. It's not, for me, it's not only VR and AR, it's all this emerging tech kind of pushing this transformation forward. And what does that mean? And from the marketing perspective, I think it's specifically content. Okay.
Oscar, what's your view on this?
I think you kind of nailed it there. And it's this ongoing, continuous change, which I think what I was trying to hint at earlier is I think a lot of people are still behind. But if you look at the way the mobile phone is now ubiquitous, all these technologies about AR, VR, and the way that we communicate becomes ubiquitous. And there's a consequence of that, which is that the way we have to think about communication has to completely and utterly change. In the same way that the way we communicated to sell goods was all about posters and TV and all this other stuff. And then the internet has completely blown that away. I mean, it's not that we don't do those things anymore. It's just that they've taken a different role, and the way that we use them has completely changed. You don't sell a mobile phone game on a TV ad. You try and build its scale and build the brand for the company on the TV ad. That's the difference in my thinking, where that's really pivotal. And again, as we start getting more and more into the ways of looking at the different ways of displaying things, whether it's on a screen or whether it's in the environment, which I think is increasingly what we're talking about, again, that's going to completely change and pivot the way we have to behave, because these things will just become normal and they will become something which is instinctive. And the reason why they happen like that is because they're generally more interesting ways to operate.
Okay. Katie, what about you? What's your thoughts on this?
So generally, I think the longer that something's been around, the more chance someone has had to use it and see it, and the more chance that's being shared amongst people that won't necessarily see that technology. And in terms of developers, naturally, we get better at designing for it. But what really I feel like needs to change is it's just accessibility. This is accessibility in terms of the actual price, the availability. It's accessible training. And it's most of all accessible software design. So this is designing for older people, younger people. It's making things friendly, delightful to interact, not phasing them when they look at it, and having basically unbreakable UI. And I think it's only really that's when smartphones really took off, when the UI changed to being something so friendly and inherently easy to use that people started buying it and sharing it and giving it to their older members of their family who started using it, and teachers started using it in classes. So, accessibility.
Okay. Well, as always, we like to give our listeners a way to find out a little bit more about what you are up to. We ask you to do that by sharing with us your social media handle of choice. Would you care to tell us what that is, Shafi?
Okay, hi. So my social hashtags are: Twitter is @Shafi Ahmed 5, Instagram and Snapchat. I'm known as the Virtual Surgeon, or just Virtual Surgeon, that there. And I do a lot of work on Facebook. You can follow my Facebook page or follow me where I share a lot of my stories on a global level.
Wonderful, thank you. And Katie, what about your good self?
So I'm at Katie_TriangularPixels on Twitter. But otherwise, you can see us at TriangularPixel on
Wonderful.
Twitter.
Thank you. And Kathy, what about yourself?
My handles across social are at Kathy, Cathy, Hackle, HACKL.
So I have a complicated Twitter handle. So it's Athanasius, which is at ATHANATEUS.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us and thank you for listening. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe and review and follow us on Twitter at Digital Jam Ltd. Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk. DigitalJamSessions.com